I'm going to do my best to finish up this section. As I said last week, we're going to try to finish up the section on the Protestant Reformation this week. And as I was typing the PowerPoint for it, I thought, wow, there's actually quite a bit here that I hope we can get through in one more lesson. But we're going to do our best, and I think we will. But sometimes when I'm typing it up, it seems like more than it actually is when we're going through it. So I think we'll be all right this morning. But we're continuing on. And this is not so much looking at the Reformation itself now. We've looked at some of the key figures in the Reformation and things that were going on during that time. But we've ended this section with Protestant persecution of Baptists, because that is a very important and evident part of history, is that there was persecution. Even though the Protestants themselves were persecuted by Catholics, there was persecution in the from the Protestants to the Baptists. Now, I don't know when I want to read this. This probably be a good time to read this. And I forgot to print it out, but I'm going to do my best to find it. I read something yesterday that was it was an article that was really goes along with this series, and now we'll see if I can even find it. There we go, if I can go to my right spot here. It goes along really with this series, because there it is. I saw a headline about there being some unrest in Northern Ireland yesterday. I saw that apparently there's some problems in Northern Ireland. They have a long history of unrest and violence. What is the root of that violence? And the article was called "What is Behind the Latest Unrest in Northern Ireland?" Now, there's actually it's two-pronged. One has to do with the barriers regarding trade that the UK set up with the European Union when the UK exited the European Union. So that's part of what's prompting this violence. But the article goes on also to highlight that the way it ties in with Ireland itself is that Northern Ireland is part of the UK and Ireland is not. But why is that? And the article goes on to explain the history behind that. And it says, young people have hurled bricks, fireworks, and gasoline bombs at police and set hijacked cars and a bus on fire during a week of violence on the streets of Northern Ireland. Police responded with rubber bullets and water cannons. The streets were calmer Friday night as community leaders appealed for calm after the death of Prince Philip, Queen Elizabeth II's 99-year-old husband. But small gangs of youths pelted police with objects and set a car ablaze during sporadic outbreaks in Belfast. The chaotic scenes have stirred memories of decades of Catholic-Protestant conflict known as the Troubles. A 1998 peace deal ended large-scale violence but did not resolve Northern Ireland's deep-rooted tensions. A look back at the background to the new violence. It says, why is Northern Ireland a contested land? Geographically, Northern Ireland is part of Ireland. Politically, it's part of the United Kingdom. Ireland, long dominated by its bigger neighbor, broke free about 100 years ago after centuries of colonization and an uneasy union. 26 of its 32 counties became an independent Roman Catholic majority country. 6 countries in the north, which have a Protestant majority, stayed British. Northern Ireland's Catholic minority experienced discrimination in jobs, housing, and other areas in the Protestant-run state. In the 1960s, a Catholic civil rights movement demanded change but faced a harsh response from the government and police. Some people on both the Catholic and Protestant sides formed armed groups that escalated the violence with bombings and shootings. The British Army was deployed in 1969, initially to keep the peace. The situation deteriorated into a conflict between Irish Republican militants who wanted to unite with the South, Loyalist paramilitaries who sought to keep Northern Ireland British, and UK troops. During 3 decades of conflict, more than 3,600 people, a majority of them civilians, were killed in bombings and shootings. So that was during 3 decades, 3,600 people were killed, bombings and shootings. Most were in Northern Ireland, though the Irish Republican Army also set off bombs in London and other British cities. By the 1990s, After secret talks and with the help of diplomatic efforts by Ireland, Britain, and the United States, the combatants reached a peace deal. The 1998 Good Friday Accord saw the paramilitaries lay down their arms and established a Catholic Protestant power-sharing government for Northern Ireland. The question of Northern Ireland's ultimate status was deferred. It would remain British as long as that was the majority's wish, but a future referendum on reunification was not ruled out. While the peace has largely endured, small Irish Republican Army splinter groups have mounted occasional attacks on security forces, and there have been outbreaks of sectarian street violence. Politically, the power-sharing arrangement has had periods of success and failure. The Belfast administration collapsed in January 2017 over a botched green energy project. It remained suspended for more than 2 years amid a rift between British Unionists and Irish nationalist parties over culture and political issues, including the status of the Irish language. Northern Ireland's government resumed work at the start of 2020, but there remains deep mistrust on both sides. And it goes into how the exit of Britain from the EU has complicated things. It has to do with the border and regarding trade. The violence, why has violence erupted now? The violence has largely been in Protestant areas in and around Belfast and Northern Ireland's second city, Londonderry, although the disturbances have spread to Catholic neighborhoods. And so there we see that even decades after, there are Catholic areas, there are Protestant areas, and the whole reason for the division, Northern Ireland and Ireland themselves, was because of religion. It had to do with Catholic, and it had to do with Protestant. And so that's just a real world, modern day example of the legacy of when you have church-state relationships and you have they even said a power-sharing agreement between the Catholic and Protestants, that if there's power-sharing between the Catholic and Protestants, it means one side has been trying to rule the other, or the majority, if one area is Protestant majority, then it's going to be the Catholics who are either discriminated against or persecuted, or it's in Ireland there are majority Catholic, and so that's the dynamics of what happens when you have this church-state relationship, and how when the religious majority affects even the political boundaries of a country. So that ties in with our lessons here regarding the history there in Europe and there in Great Britain, Ireland, and gives you an idea of even today what's going on that's now being exacerbated by other factors. But really you look back and see the roots of the church-state relationships and the conflicts between the religions. But we're going to continue here in Protestant persecution of Baptists. Urbanus Regius was a Lutheran leader in Augsburg who persecuted Baptists. He published a book against the Baptists in 1528, and the main illustration on this book showed a river running into a large ocean-like expanse of water. The Baptists are depicted tumbling into the water and being carried out to sea into a flaming fire. And so the picture there that was being portrayed was, well, these Baptists, they're going into the water all right, but it's taking them straight to hell, basically, was the message being portrayed there. He was the chief instigator of persecutions in the Protestant city of Augsburg. Philip Schaff, who is a Lutheran historian, wrote, Regius stirred up the magistrates against them. Hans Koch and Leonard Meister were put to death in 1524. Regius caused Baptist pastor Hans Denk to be driven out of the city in 1527. He caused Pastor Langenmentel to be arrested and banished the same year. Leonard Snyder was put to death in 1527. Many died in prison, including Hans Hut, whose dead body was burned in the public square. Baptist pastor Siebold was put to death in 1528, and 12 more were killed later that year. Many others were tortured and branded. The Lutheran reformer Oziander in Nuremberg persecuted Anabaptists in his area. The one who I just mentioned, Hans Denk, was a principal of a Lutheran school in Nuremberg before he became a pastor in Augsburg. As he developed Anabaptist views, he came into conflict with the Protestants. In January of 1525, Denk was banished from the city by Oziander and was warned that he would be put to death if he ever came within 10 miles of it. He became the pastor of a strong Baptist church in Augsburg, but was eventually driven out by Regius. John Calvin enforced Christian doctrine and principles at the point of a sword. We've talked about him and some things he supported, such as Michael Servetus was burned for heresy by the Geneva government. Calvin was in support of that. Now, Servetus was a heretic. He did not necessarily believe the Bible, but I believe he was Unitarian. But at the same time, the main point of that is whether they're right or wrong doesn't make burning people at the stake for their beliefs right. In the days of King Edward VI of England, Calvin wrote a letter to Lord Protector Somerset and urged him to put Anabaptists to death. He wrote, "These altogether deserve to be well punished by the sword, seeing that they do conspire against God, who had set him in his royal seat," according to John Christian. Christian, a historian, wrote that Calvin, quote, "was responsible in a large measure for the demon of hate and fierce hostility which the Baptists of England had to encounter." And Martin Bucer was influential in Augsburg, Germany, and sought to have the city council persecute the Baptists. He was constantly frustrated with the city council because they hesitated to persecute the Anabaptists as fiercely as he desired. One time when they did fulfill his wishes was with Pilgrim Marbeck, who was banished from Augsburg on December 18, 1531. He had been a noted civil engineer who fled Catholic persecution and preached against both Catholic and Protestant errors. Bucer supported his banishment, which was in the cold of winter. Preachers Jacob Kantz and Reublin were imprisoned. He had called the reformers, Kantz called the reformers, quote, "unskilled carpenters who tear down much but are unable to put anything together." While in prison, they wrote in defense of believers' baptism as a symbolic expression of a believer's faith in Christ. And the city council drove all Baptists from the city in 1534. They only gave them 8 days warning. There's that 8 days again. We are the number 8 again. This seems to come up quite a bit. But they only gave them 8 days warning. The following year, the city council proclaimed that all infants must be baptized or the parents would be punished. In 1538, the council proclaimed that those who returned to the city the first time would be punished and drowned the second time. The first time they would be punished if they would lose a finger, be branded in the cheek, or put in a neck iron. The proclamation said, "We do this not to make men believe as we do. It is not a matter of faith, but to prevent division in the church." But the problem is, divisions in the church usually have to do with a matter of faith, and it was because people didn't believe like they did is why they were doing those things. But also, as we've said, to consolidate, continue their power. The Anglicans in England persecuted Baptists and others who descended from the state church over a period of about 150 years. The Protestants who settled in America, Protestants who settled in America persecuted Baptists, Quakers, and others. And this is where we're going to get into some of the what happened in America. So this was after the Reformation period, but this is a continuation of things that had taken place in Europe. Massachusetts was founded by the Pilgrims of Plymouth in 1620, and the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, and eventually the Pilgrims ended up being absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But the Pilgrims were separatists from the Church of England, and the Puritans desired reform in the Church of England. That's why they were called Puritans. And both groups practiced infant baptism and denounced Anabaptists. Roger Williams was an Anglican pastor who was banished from Massachusetts in 1635 for preaching, quote, "new and dangerous opinions." And he preached to the natives and later became the pastor of the Anglican congregation in Salem. He initially practiced infant baptism, but he believed in religious liberty. In January of 1636, he was forced into the wilderness, but the Indians helped him. In June, he traveled to Rhode Island and established the settlement of Providence. This place became a bastion of religious liberty with the purpose, quote, to hold forth a lively experiment that a most flourishing civil state may stand and best be maintained with full liberty in religious concernments. And so Rhode Island was the first colony to, and the first settlement, what would become Rhode Island, was the first settlement there to actually practice that and put it into full force of that there would be religious liberty. It was a haven for the Quakers, it was a haven for the Baptists, it was a haven for the Jews, it was a haven for different groups who were being oppressed in other places. Williams was publicly immersed in 1639, and the First Baptist Church of Rhode Island was formed. And for our purposes here, we're not going to get into the history of that. Williams evidently was not there in that church very long, and so there's some Baptist historians who would say, well, this wasn't really the first true Baptist church in Rhode Island. It was actually the one in Newport, which is called the Second Baptist Church with John Clark. And so Baptist historians would maybe dispute that. As a matter of fact, I was on a trip with a group of people in 2010, and it was a church planning survey trip. Now, we already knew where we were going. We were going to be helping with a church start in Connecticut, but we were living in Michigan at the time, and it just seemed like a good opportunity to go on that trip and see some things and visit some, go on this trip with some other men. And so we visited we went to Providence and we visited the First Baptist Church. It's called the First Baptist Church in America because it is considered that. And so one of the men who was leading the trip, he said to the woman who was there, kind of showing us around, and he said, "Now some would say that this wasn't the First Baptist Church in America; it was really John Clark in Newport." And she just said, and I don't remember the exact quote, but just the way she said it, she was not very pleased with that statement. And she said, I believe our history has satisfied that question. Basically, we're not talking about that. No country. Unfortunately, many of these churches, these historical churches that have such a great heritage, are full of dead men's bones now, really spiritually. And many of them, many of those historic churches in New England are part of the American Baptist Church's denomination, and they're just really spiritually dead. And as a matter of fact, on that trip, in that visit, one of them asked the woman who basically, how does your church grow? And she said, mostly it's just people coming in from different places, different churches, and they asked, I don't know if they asked about baptism, and she said, oh yeah, basically it had been a long, long time since they had baptized anybody, and she says, and she even said this, you wouldn't want to get baptized in our baptistry anyway, it was so dirty back there, and I mean, just very, very nonchalant and down on even baptizing people there, and that's unfortunately the state of many of those churches. So while there's a fascinating history, it's very interesting to learn about that history. Spiritually speaking, there's nothing going on in these churches that even have such historical significance. And that's sad to say, but that is just the way it is. And it's repeated throughout many of those kind of churches, those older historic Baptist churches. Unfortunately, doesn't necessarily mean there's spiritual vibrancy and solid gospel preaching there now. But from a historical perspective, it was interesting. As far as I know, apparently John D. Rockefeller taught Sunday school there, is what they said. The oil baron. So interesting. He had gifted, part of the way they did a lot of renovations to the building, he had gifted them a lot of Standard Oil stock, and they were able to use that. So they're able somehow, with investments and money coming in from somewhere, they're able to keep these things going just barely, I guess. But unfortunately, they're not thriving, vibrant churches of just beacons for the truth and the gospel in many of those cases. And then another example was Deborah Moody of Swampscott was forced to move She owned a 400-acre farm there. By the way, I think that's where Governor Baker lives. I think he's got his house is there. She owned a 400-acre farm, but went to live among the Dutch because she denied infant baptism. She moved to Long Island, where the Dutch had settled, and simply denying infant baptism. Here she is with this property and this large farm, but she lost it and was forced to move. The first law against the Baptists in America was made in Massachusetts in 1644. Thomas Painter was whipped for denying infant baptism. In February of 1646, William Whittier and John Wood of Lynn were publicly rebuked and fined for denying infant baptism. John Spur was fined in July of 1651 for the same thing. In 1651, John Clark, Obadiah Holmes, and John Crandall were arrested, and Holmes was whipped 30 times. They were visiting from Rhode Island, but what they would do is go from Rhode Island into the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they would be preaching, and they would try to, if there were people that wanted to be believers that wanted to be baptized, rebaptized in the Puritans' eyes, then they would do that. And at the time, there were no existing churches, as far as we know, in Massachusetts, Baptist churches, I mean. But they were visiting William Whittier and held a service in his house that Sunday. There were no Baptist churches in Massachusetts at that time. They were arrested during the service and taken to prison in Boston. Holmes recounted his whipping in a letter to a Baptist church in England. He said, "For in truth, as the strokes fell upon me, I had such a spiritual manifestation of God's presence, as the like thereof I never had nor felt, nor can with fleshly tongue express. And the outward pain was so removed from me, that indeed I am not able to declare it to you. It was so easy to me that I could well bear it. Yea, and in a manner felt it not, although it was grievous, as the spectators said, the man striking with all his strength, yea, spitting in his hands 3 times as many affirmed, with a 3-corded whip, giving me therewith 30 strokes. When he had loosed me from the post, having joyfulness in my heart and cheerfulness in my countenance, as the spectators observed, I told the magistrate, you have struck me as with roses." The beating was so vicious that Holmes couldn't lie down for many days afterwards. So apparently in the moment, the Lord was filling him so much that he was not feeling much of it, but it did have a profound effect on his body. John Hazel and John Spur were imprisoned because they comforted Holmes after he was whipped. The First Baptist Church in Massachusetts was formed around 1656. The members spent most of their time in courts and prisons. They were often fined, and some of them were banished. The meeting house they built had its doors nailed shut in 1680, and the church was ordered not to meet. A second Baptist church was not formed in Massachusetts until 1749 in Sturbridge. Many of the members were imprisoned, fined, and had their property confiscated. Another Baptist church was formed in 1761 in Ashfield. When Brother Danford was here last year, Josiah and I took Brother Danford down to the cemetery there in Ashfield where there are the Baptists buried, and it's kind of hard to find. Go back a dirt road, and we were not able to find. There was apparently a monument across the road where a building had stood, and we couldn't find it. But evidently, Sean Kimberly was down that way at one point, and he went looking for it, and he actually found the monument and took a picture of it. And it was actually pretty close to us. Somehow we missed it. I don't know where. We just weren't looking in the right spot. But anyway, that was one of the earliest Baptist churches in Massachusetts. And they also faced persecution. Many of the church members had their land and orchards confiscated. Persecution continued until Massachusetts became a colony of the United States and established its Constitution in 1780. And this is what the state constitution says. This is the Massachusetts Constitution regarding, this is a couple sections of the Constitution. We, therefore, the people of Massachusetts, acknowledging with grateful hearts the goodness of the great legislator of the universe in affording us, in the course of His providence and opportunity, deliberately and peaceably, without fraud, violence, or surprise, of entering into an original, explicit, and solemn compact with each other and of forming a new constitution of civil government for ourselves and posterity, and devoutly imploring His direction in so interesting a design to agree upon, ordain, and establish the following Declaration of Rights and frame of government as the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. This was Article 2 of that Bill of Rights. It is the right as well as the duty of all men in society, publicly and at stated seasons, to worship the Supreme Being, the great Creator and Preserver of the universe, and no subject shall be hurt, molested, or restrained in his person, liberty, or estate from worshiping God in the manner and season most agreeable to the dictates of his own conscience, or for his religious profession or sentiments, provided he doth not disturb the peace, disturb the public peace, or obstruct others in their religious worship. So that's a pretty explicit, that's more than even what the U.S. Constitution says. And this Article 3 kind of harkens back to the days of the Puritans and the Congregationalists, having kind of the influence and rule in a lot of ways. But Article 3 says, as the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially. Now this is profound. I mean, compared to what people think in this day and age. Just listen to this. As the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality, and as these cannot be generally diffused through a community but by the institution of the public worship of God and of the public instructions in piety, religion, and morality, therefore, to promote their happiness and to secure the good order and preservation of their government, the people of this Commonwealth have a right to invest their legislature with power to authorize and require, and the legislature shall from time to time authorize and require the several towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies politic or religious societies to make suitable provision at their own expense for the institution of the public worship of God and for the support and maintenance of public Protestant teachers of piety, religion, and morality in all cases where such provision shall not be made voluntary. And so that goes back to that forcing a bit too much on, which thankfully we do have a First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which would make sure that, let's say, in the Congregational Church, they were the established churches back at that time. And so thankfully, because of the First Amendment of the United States, they can't make you go to the Congregational Church in town, or whatever Protestant church it might be. In this case, for Massachusetts, it would have been the Congregational. But there's still the recognition in our Constitution here in the Commonwealth of the great legislator of the universe, and that and a very accurate recognition that the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality. And that is absolutely true. And what we're finding is the farther we get away from that, of morality and I would say true religion, it gets worse. Society gets worse and worse the further people get away from that. And then also, it wasn't just Massachusetts. There were some other colonies where there was persecution of Baptists by the Protestants. And we'll look at one more, the Virginia. The first settlers in Virginia were mostly from England, and they established Anglican churches. Acts in 1623, 1643, and 1661 required all citizens to follow the Anglican religion. Acts in 1659, 1662, and 1663 required all children to be baptized and prohibited the assembling of Quakers and other dissidents. And the Anglicans are in the U.S., they're known as Episcopalian. Baptists faced persecution in Virginia. In 1768, several Baptists were arrested in Spotsylvania and imprisoned for almost 6 weeks. In December of 1770, William Weber and Joseph Anthony were arrested and imprisoned for preaching in Chesterfield, Virginia. They remained in prison until March 1771. Weber was arrested a second time that year. Thomas Wofford was severely beaten with a whip. In August of 1772, James Greenwood and William Lovell were arrested and imprisoned for 16 days. On March 13, 1774, all the Baptist preachers in Piscataway were arrested and imprisoned. A total of about 30 Baptist preachers spent time in prison in Virginia during this period, and some more than once. That persecution continued until Virginia became part of the United States. In spite of the persecution, Baptist churches grew rapidly. The first church was formed in 1767 and the second in 1769. Within 4 years, there were about 50 churches. And just in closing of this section here, because that's it, God surely did not look lightly upon what took place during those centuries. While he was simultaneously, he was using the Protestant Reformation to reduce the influence and power of the Catholic Church, but at the same time, on the other hand, there were others who were apart from that Reformation, or some who came through it as far as they might have been Catholic and then they became Protestant and then they realized, oh, that's not right either, and so I'm going to believe something different. And it was what the Bible believed and Baptists believed. And so there were a couple things going on there. God was using the Reformation, but at the same time there were negative things coming out of the Reformation toward God's people, although what it did was it did strengthen their faith, and they stayed faithful, and God blessed them in the midst of that as they did stay faithful to Him. And unfortunately, I guess some historians maybe had said, well, they were just doing this in ignorance. The Protestants, they were persecuting ignorance. But here's a people, they were professing to believe the Bible. They said they believed the Bible, but yet still carried out great persecution against those who actually, they did believe the Bible, and particularly it had to do with the Bible's teaching on baptism. And so therefore, that's really where the name Baptist comes from. It has to do with both the history of, the Bible doctrine of baptism by immersion, but then also the name that was given to those, the Anabaptists and others known as Baptists, that because baptism was that pivotal doctrine that determined a lot of how people were treated and what they believed, if they were going to go along with the established church and if they were going to go along with infant baptism. And so there was great price that was paid simply for that one doctrine, very important doctrine of baptism. And thank the Lord for those who did stay faithful to the Lord through this time, and set a great example that we can look back and see the history of these and take that as encouragement of God helped them, God bless them, and God will bless those and be with those who stay faithful to Him and strengthen even through those bad times. It doesn't mean if you believe the Bible and you believe the right doctrines, it doesn't mean you're not going to face the persecution. It doesn't mean everything's just going to go smoothly. But what it does mean is God would be there to give you grace and help in that, those challenges, in that opposition. Now, thankfully, we don't face those same things today. We don't face the beatings as they did in the Massachusetts Bay Colony or in Europe and in those places where people being put to death. Thankfully, that's not the issue at this point. But there are many ways opposition comes to the truth of God's Word, and opposition comes to you for standing for your faith. It takes different forms, but it all comes back to needing to stay faithful to the Lord and to what the Bible says.